Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final day of the Greenlight Guru True Quality Virtual Summit. I hope you've had a chance to enjoy the last few days of learning actionable tips, trends, and best practices to achieve true quality for your medical devices and business. This session is on why remote research is or isn't right for your project. My name is Tom Risch, Medical Device Guru here at Greenlight Guru, and I'll be your moderator for this special session. I know our speakers, Mowrey and Colton Turner, are really looking forward to sharing their expertise to help you understand when remote research supports good decision-making, what to consider regarding your unique project, and when it might be best to wait for in-person research. Before we dive too deep into today's presentation and introduce our speakers and their company, Priority Designs, I'm going to touch on a few items real quick. First, this session is going to run about 45 minutes in total, and we'll try to leave time for a short Q&A session at the end where Katie and Colton have been kind enough to answer your questions. I encourage you to submit questions throughout the presentation as they come up in the box on the right-hand side, and we'll get to as many of them as time permits. If we don't get to them, we'll have a list of them and do our best to follow up with those that are applicable. This entire session will be recorded, and you'll have access to it via email after this session. Once this session ends, there's going to be a 10-minute break before the next live session begins. If you're interested in learning about remote audits in a COVID-19 world, make sure you're registered for that next session and use your unique link to tune in. If you haven't already signed up, you can sign up at virtual-summit.greenlight.guru. I'd also like to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we're putting on this free virtual summit. If you've been on one of our training sessions before, then you know we put these on because improving the quality of life is our mission here at Greenlight Guru, likely a similar mission as many of you at today's summit. Anything we can do as an organization that helps device makers bring safer, life-changing devices to market quicker and with less risk aligns with that mission. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether that's through hosting free events and training sessions, through partnering with world-class medical device consultants, or through our award-winning medical device QMS software. If you'd like to learn more about why medical device companies from across the globe are moving away from paper-based general-purpose quality management systems and adopting a purpose-built medical device quality management software, I encourage you to head on over to www.greenlight.guru after today's presentation to schedule your free personalized one-on-one demo. Now on to today's presentation. Let me give a proper introduction to today's presenters. Katie is a senior human factors specialist at Priority Designs, an ISO 13485 certified medical product device development consultancy with experts in human factors, industrial design, mechanical, electrical, and software engineering and prototyping. She has more than 15 years of experience in the field of human factors applied to industries such as healthcare, defense, automotive, retail, web, consumer products, and software applications. Katie adds an understanding of human psychology to her user experience design acumen, ensuring end user needs and desires are met via usable and safe product interfaces. Katie's psychology background ensures each research program has the appropriate level of control and external validity needed to instill confidence. She is joined by Colton, who has a PhD in human factors psychology and 5 years of experience in applied human factors research across the consumer, industrial, and medical device industries. As a member of the product development team at Priority Designs, Colton helps to cater to the end user by conducting and analyzing user research and applying his knowledge of human factors principles throughout the product development lifecycle. Most of his work at Priority Design centers around developing and carrying out formative evaluations of medical devices in accordance with FDA human factors guidelines. Colton also stays active in the academic literature, routinely publishing his research on the usability of text-to-input methods on small-screen devices, as well as the future of text input in augmented virtual reality. So without further ado, let me hand it over to your presenters, Katie and Colton.
Thank you, Tom. So thank you all for tuning in today. As Tom mentioned, we're here to talk about remote research. As many of you have probably experienced in the recent months, remote research has been thrust upon us as a reality to keep things moving forward in our product development process. Here at PD, things are no different. We do a lot of work on medical devices as well as consumer products, tools, sporting goods, you name it. And all of our clients are trying to keep things moving forward with their usability testing, their concept evaluations, from early iterative testing all the way through final validation testing. So we've really worked hard in the most recent months to figure out how to pivot, how to adjust the way that we work, and keep things moving for them. So we've learned a lot of lessons in the last few months. So we're here to share those with you here today. Hopefully, as we move forward, remote research won't be a requirement in the next year or so, but we believe that it could become something that's used more frequently as we learn how to use technology to support it and how to make it useful to create efficiencies in the work that we're doing. So hopefully these are lessons that we can share with you that will hold true for years to come. So moving forward, you'll get to see Colton's face here in just a few minutes. He's sitting a safe distance away here, and we'll slide in when his slides come along. But I'll give you a quick outline of what we're going to be talking about today. The first one is, sort of facetious, but of course, we've all heard that there's a pandemic happening. And this has created, like I said, it thrust upon us a need for moving forward in a way that we're not used to, re-examining our methods and figuring out how to keep business going. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that's affected us at PD. We'll move into the benefits of remote research, what you can get out of it, and then the hurdles and how you can sort of work around those hurdles. We definitely have mitigations for a lot of them, but we'll also attach or address when it's best to wait. So, there are certain types of research that maybe you shouldn't be doing remotely, and we'll talk about what circumstances apply there. And then finally wrap up with some key takeaways and hopefully leave some time for questions at the end. So getting into our first section, I think many of us have been in the same boat where we're trying to identify whether to keep moving with research or to press pause. With the uncertainty of when face-to-face research can resume, which we've recently just done at Priority Designs in the last week with a lot of safety constraints in place, our clients and have been really thinking about, well, if in the next week we can get face-to-face, we're just going to hold off. But a week turns to 2, turns to 3, turns to 4. And suddenly what we're seeing is that our clients have now been waiting 3 months for something that they thought might only take a week or two of a delay. And they're starting to rethink whether or not remote research makes more sense. So the tips that we're going to be giving you today might help you to identify whether it makes sense to keep moving forward with remote research or just wait until you can get into a lab-based setting with your participants where you have more control. And secondly, we've been forced to rethink how we do our research. So examining the variables that come into play when you're doing remote research can be a little bit more time-consuming. It really requires you to think through your experimental method, as you always should, but how that might be impacted by the context of remote research becomes a big reality here. And how you can still get good data by using remote research is something that we'll cover as well. So what are some of the benefits if you decide to move forward with remote research? It can still be great. So for instance, in the medical device space, obviously home use medical devices are becoming more and more popular. So in this case, why not test them in the home? In this context, we can understand the environment, the sights, the smells, the sounds, the surfaces that our users would be using in their home to interact with the device that we are testing. So it gives us a lot more information about the ecosystem around the product and how it's going to be used, what distractors might come into play, the fact that a user maybe doesn't have as large of a clear surface to work with as we thought they would. That's all information that we can get from testing in home. And this provides an advantage to help them do that testing from the comfort of their own home and give us that added context that we might be looking for. Another thing that I've experienced is that testing in homes can often be intimidating for participants. So inviting strangers into your home is uncomfortable, especially I've seen it with women inviting two male researchers into their house don't always feel super comfortable with that. So in this case, participants can feel a little safer being a little more distant from the researchers. Maybe they don't feel like they have to clean their house before the research team comes in and so forth. It's plug and play. They can do their session. They can feel safe, and we can understand the context. So in this case, remote research might have a benefit. Secondly, tools that allow you to do real-time documentation, like mobile survey tools, mobile ethnography tools, can be really advantageous in this context. So there are a lot of tools out there. We like Indemo, but there are many others that are really, really valuable tools that you can look up that allow participants to diary or journal their experience in real time. What this does is immediately after they've had an experience over a longitudinal amount of time, like a week or 2 weeks, they can document, I was interacting with the product at 11 p.m. on this day, and this is the experience that I had, rather than waiting for their interview that's happening 3 days later to tell us about their experience. They can document it there. It's data that we can see as researchers before the interview and probe into a little bit further. They can interact with this type of interface multiple times over the course of a week or 2 weeks in preparation for their interview. And we like to use these in conjunction with a one-on-one interview so that we can follow up. I know that some studies can often use these as well independently, where they're just using these to collect as the sole source of collection of data. But what it also does is it primes the participant for the context of the interview. It gets them thinking about the experience before they come in and talk, or before they remote in and talk to you about their experience for, a process that they might have begun to take advantage or take for granted. So they're not really thinking about their experience because they do it so commonly. It's just the same every time. And this really gets them to think critically about that experience before they talk to you. So there's an advantage in using these types of tools remotely to collect data prior to an interview. When you get into the live interview, this is actually me and Colton. Colton's demonstrating or user testing his espresso machine, and he looks very excited to get into his espresso. But what this does is it demonstrates how much you can see doing a live web interview. So I can see Colton's reaction. I can see what he's looking at, how he's holding the handle on the top, specifically what he's doing. And he can talk me through and think aloud, just as I would in a face-to-face interview. I can probe into this experience. He can see my face so that we can communicate directly. There's a lot of advantages that go along with this type of interview that you can sort of get remotely just as well. I can probe into this experience in the moment. As long as my internet connection isn't getting in the way, I can interrupt, I can ask questions, and I can understand fully what his experience is like, just as I would in person. However, with the benefits that I've just discussed, there are definitely some hurdles that come into play. And I'm going to talk through those next and help you to understand how we mitigate for many of those hurdles and how you can plan around them. So what we're going to go over today in the hurdles are just the first hurdle of building rapport. As many of you know who do research, building rapport can be challenging even in person, but it is critical. If you're going to get somebody comfortable enough to share their innermost thoughts and experiences, maybe things that might not be popular to say, you want them to get comfortable. And now you're asking them to get comfortable talking to you through a computer, which can be a little bit more difficult, especially if technical challenges come in, things are choppy, you're talking over each other, and so forth. So we've developed some ways to kind of get around that we'll discuss. Secondly, we'll talk about observer anonymity. This is if you have research team members or research sponsor members who would like to watch the sessions. Many of these web meeting platforms don't allow those people to watch anonymously. So we'll talk through those challenges. If the context of use is not intended for home use, now you're changing the context of use and and that could be a challenge that we'll talk about. You lose experimental control, not testing in your lab. Many variables can come into play that are outside of your control. Obviously, there are logistical challenges that we'll address in managing, especially if you're testing a physical product that you have to send to their home. But all of those are hurdles that we've gone through just within the last 2 weeks with one of our clients and have come up with great ways of working around these challenges. And then finally, there's the confidentiality of your product is what we're referring to here. So many times you're sending your IP out to these people. This is a developmental prototype that you're sharing with them over a screen or that you're sending to their home. And how do you keep your designs confidential in these circumstances? So first we'll get into building rapport. So building rapport, like I said, it can be tougher if you're doing that through a computer. It's maybe a little uncomfortable, especially with people who are not comfortable with technology, to try to talk and build a relationship with someone through a computer. I think the most recent months have forced us all to get a little bit more comfortable with it if we want to talk to any of our loved ones. But I think it still doesn't replace a face-to-face conversation and building relationships that way. Layer on top of that problems with technology that can make for an awkward or frustrating start to your conversation. So those first few minutes in an interview are critical. Those minutes are used to make the participant feel comfortable, to make the participant help them understand the expectations of the interview. Hopefully you're setting the stage that they are the expert and they're there to teach you what their experience is like. And if you're trying to build through all of that on top of choppy, pixelated video, and you're talking over each other like we've all experienced on a conference call, or they're struggling with their technology to even get the call started, it stresses everyone out and it makes the start a lot more rocky. So that can be the first challenge. However, there are definitely ways to get around this. So first of all, I would recommend that you add time. So just add time both before the call to help them with their tech challenges, and Colton will go over that in just a moment, but also just a little more time to chat at the beginning of the meeting, just so you can ask them what they've been up to for the last week and if they're doing okay and if they received the product that you're sending, and just allow them to get comfortable with you as a person, help them understand that they are speaking to a real person even though they're staring at a computer screen, and help them to get comfortable. I would also recommend that you just acknowledge the awkwardness of talking through a computer. Just be upfront with the fact that, hey, I know this isn't the most comfortable way all the time to communicate with each other, and we're in this together. If we lose connection, I will call you back. It's critical that you set up a plan in the beginning if something goes wrong with the technology, so that they don't feel responsible for getting the call back online. Let them know it could happen and that's okay. And I'll make sure that we get back on the phone. If not, I'll call your cell phone. We'll get things straightened out. It's just a reality of the situation. You cannot control for their Wi-Fi. So you're just going to have to acknowledge that problems might exist and be okay with it. Finally, this applies to moderating in general. Just be human, humble, and humorous. Try to lighten the mood. Try to help them understand that you're just as handcuffed by the technology as they are, and that, again, you're just going to get through this together. You're going to do a great job of helping us to understand what your experience is like with this product or with this interface, and this is valuable to us despite any challenges that we might experience along the way. So just, again, help them to understand that you're in the same boat and that you're trying to get through this together. Moving on to the second hurdle, which is observer anonymity. This is something that I've experienced personally a lot in the last 6 months, not just because of COVID-19, but because a lot of our research has been focused on evaluating 2D concepts nationwide. So I can interview someone in California over the phone, share my screen, and get their feedback. This is great. This is something that I see us continuing doing in the years to come. However, there are challenges with allowing your clients or sponsors or company team members to watch those calls. Many of these online conference softwares will show quite a bit of information about the attendees that are on the call. Now, if your participant is also an equivalent participant on that call, they can see that information as well. So the challenge is here, participants may be able to see the volume of observers, which can be intimidating. If you have 15 people calling in from the client side and they see 15 people are watching them, that's quite a different experience than if those 15 people are behind a one-way mirror and they can't see them. Now, in a usability lab, they know someone's back there typically, but knowing how many people can be a different experience altogether. Secondly, some of these softwares will display the email address or other credentials about the observers. Again, sort of further exposing them. If my email is shown kmowrey@prioritydesigns.com, they know exactly what company I work for, and they might know now who made the product that I'm testing. And we usually try to keep that blind as much as possible. So that's another one. Also, one unexpected challenge that we came up with recently, luckily we didn't step in it with this one, but it's something that we realized early. Meeting chat is visible to the participant. So the attendees cannot send chat messages within the meeting. This is specific to Teams that we've been using, could be with other softwares as well. If a client has a question for the participant and they send it through chat, the participant can see that because they are also a participant in the meeting. So we have ways that we've worked around that as well. And then finally, some softwares display the location of the research participants. So a different platform that I've used actually shows the name of the participant on the call and a pin and a map of where they are in the country. So if, for instance, there's 20 pins in Dallas, Texas, and you're testing a very specific type of device, you're one quick Google search away from figuring out which company is headquartered in Dallas, Texas that makes this type of device. And a savvy participant can easily figure out, again, who the manufacturer is of the device that you're testing. So these are all things that you have to be careful of in these remote interview contexts. I wanted to throw Colton under the bus here for just a moment. And maybe Teams a little bit. But if we're looking at this recent interview that I did, you can make fun of me too, because my face is very intense down there in the bottom corner. But what I'm doing is interviewing the participant. My camera's on, so you can see me because I want to build that rapport with her again. I want her to see me paying attention to her, talking to her, and so forth. But there's a few things that I want to point out about what is displayed. So you see here on the bottom, we've got the full names of everyone who participated and watched that session. So again, all I have to do is go to LinkedIn, look up that name, and I know who's on that call. I know what company they work for. I didn't have any clients on this one. These are all PD employees. But if my clients had been on the call, which they were invited to do, they could easily look them up on LinkedIn and find out who the manufacturer of this product was. Secondly, Colton has a profile picture, as you see in the bottom side there, attached to his Teams. So now not only do we see Colton's name, but we see his photo, which is just more, further identifying information about who is attending the session, who's watching. So again, this didn't worry us as much because these are all members of the research and design team, and our client or our participant knew we were from Priority Designs, but had my clients been on the call, they would have been more exposed. So moving forward, how do we get some anonymity here? So many of these platforms don't require you to fill out all fields when you're entering a meeting. So just make sure you don't fill out fields that are not required. Use only your first name. If a last name is required, use only your last initial to fill out that field to keep some anonymity. Don't use a service that requires you to enter your company name and email address to enter the meeting, as those will likely be displayed. Dial in 5 minutes early. This is to keep from interrupting the call as an observer, and not to intimidate the participant. If they hear 20 beeps after they call in and they know that 20 people have just dialed in to listen, that can be intimidating and make them nervous. If they dial in and they hear nothing because everyone else is already on the line and silently waiting, that's a better experience. Finally, of course, keep your mic on mute, keep your camera off, silently watch. And one other thing that I wanted to add that I neglected to add here is, if you do want to chat during the meeting and send the moderator questions, set up a separate chat service like Slack or some other software that you can send in questions that the participant won't see. And that's what we do here at PD. Okay, so finally getting into context of use, what if the product isn't intended for home use? So then you're changing, like I said, you're changing the context of use in the evaluation of your product and possibly changing the outcome, the data that you might get. What if the product is intended to be shared by more than one user? This is especially common in a medical environment where a nurse and a surgeon could be highly collaborative in the use of a product. And so how do you test that when they're not together? And lastly, if the intended use is more active, where they're not supposed to be sitting at a desk looking at a computer or holding a mobile phone, how do you get at product use when they don't have both hands available or intended use? Mitigation of this, if it's the environment, you really have to think this through. This is where you might sort of decide to wait. So you have to think hard about whether aspects of the environment can be simulated. For instance, if you want to know if participants can hear and identify alarms made by a particular device, can you somehow simulate the surgical suite sounds through the interaction so that you're mimicking that type of environment? Can you somehow simulate that for them? In a group use setting, can a researcher role play as the other user to simulate that half of the experience? For instance, if the medical assistant is calling out information to the surgeon as they interact with the device, can someone play that role so that the surgeon can still go through his or her steps and give you the feedback that you're looking for? Finally, intended use. This one's a pretty easy one to get around, and you saw it in the image that I showed you earlier. Just try to figure out if you can mount the device in some way. We sent a tripod with our cameras into people's homes so that they weren't having to hold the camera. They had both hands available to interact with the device. And the computer and the camera were completely out of their way, and they weren't really having to look at any of it as they went through the experience. So with that said, I'm going to pass this over to Colton and allow him to go through some remaining hurdles in remote research.
Thanks, Katie. We'll play musical chairs here and maintain our social distance. So as Katie said, I'm going to go into our next hurdle, which is experimental control. So experimental control is really the most important thing we have to consider when we're talking about a research project. Experimental control is what allows us to say that the differences that we're observing in our research are really due to the device that we're testing and not some other variable that we weren't able to control or didn't consider. And that's one of the reasons that we love in-person research so much, is because it allows us to bring participants into a really controlled environment. We bring them into the usability lab. The lights are the same, the sounds are the same, the distractions are the same for all participants. Now, when we get into remote research, we lose a lot of that control and we're not able to control for as many variables, which is fine. That doesn't mean that remote research is bad. It just means that there's areas where remote research works and areas where it doesn't work. And that's what we have to take into account when we're deciding, should this be a remote or an in-person study? Some instances of that are tasks like time on task. If there is a time-sensitive task that you really need to get a baseline understanding of user performance, doing that remotely may not be the best case scenario because you cannot control for all of the distractions that may be going on in someone's home. Secondly, there may be things like audio cues that you want to test with a participant. But again, you may not be able to control the noise and the sounds of the environment that that participant is in order to really display that audio tone in a way that allows them to respond to it. So we'll kind of talk about that as we go on. So what's kind of our mitigation here? How do we control for these things? Well, first off, just kind of what I was saying, you really have to consider the impact that those variables are going to have on your control. If you really need to get time on task baseline measurements, remote may not be the best because you can't control for a toddler walking into the room that's distracting your participant because he wants his mom or his dad. And that really takes the attention away from the participant. Or you can't control that the participant's going to get a phone call and divert their attention, which can really impact your overall study data that you're getting. So one of the instances of things that we can do to resolve that is to really probe the root cause. So for example, let's imagine that we're evaluating an IFU and a participant skips a step. And they just happen to skip the step because their phone rang or their doorbell rang. And then the question becomes, well, did they skip the step because of the distraction, or did they skip the step because of the way the IFU is designed and written? So really kind of asking them to explain what was going on in that scenario, what they were doing, and trying to understand what caused them to skip that step is something that's really important, specifically in remote research when you can't control for all of those variables. And then finally, the other mitigation is sometimes you just have to admit that with remote research, you're gonna have participants that you have to throw out. You have to throw them out because maybe their Wi-Fi wasn't working and they couldn't understand what you were saying, you couldn't understand what they were saying. There was a lot of distractions. They were answering the door to get their pizza delivery and they weren't really listening to what you were saying, and they weren't really compliant with the instructions of the moderator. So sometimes those are things that happen because we can't control that environment. And so in those instances, we may throw those participants out and we'll recruit extras to fill in so that we don't lose time in the overall study plan. The next remote research hurdle that we'll talk about is the logistical challenges. So this is something that we've experienced a lot lately and something that we've been doing a lot of work to kind of mitigate as much as we can. And there's really kind of three logistical challenges that I want to talk about today. The first being Wi-Fi. So as we all know, in this new remote world, Wi-Fi and video conferences are awesome, but they're only awesome when they work. And it seems like they really don't work as much as we want them to. So very rarely do you have the perfect Wi-Fi connection where you can hear everybody the entire time. Also rarely do you have a participant that may have all of the tech that they need to conduct that session. So they have a laptop that's working, that runs really well. They have a great webcam. They have a phone screen that isn't cracked, that has a really good camera. And so those are all things that we kind of have to consider when we're proposing a remote research study is what's kind of the technical limitations of the participant group that we're expecting, and also how are we going to address any Wi-Fi conditions or issues that we may encounter. Secondly, another logistical challenge is the increased amount of time it takes to ship and disinfect prototypes between participants. So in a lot of the usability studies we're doing, we are actually mailing prototype physical devices to participants' homes. And then we're having them go through the usability evaluation, and then they're sending those things back to us and we have to clean them. And then we send them out to the next participant. That is a huge logistical challenge and something that you need to account ahead of time and build into your timeline. You're talking 3 to 5 days from recruitment or from getting all of your materials ready and shipped to the participant before those materials return to you to be cleaned. And then you have to wait for the cleaning procedure, all things that can affect timeline. And then finally, the kind of the worst case scenario is that prototypes and test materials that are shipped and mailed, as great as the Postal Service is, that doesn't mean that they're going to get there in one piece. So all it takes is a participant that pulls a little too hard or pushes a little too hard and breaks the prototype. A box that gets stepped on or thrown a little too hard in transit, or God forbid that it gets lost somewhere in the mailing system and you have no idea where your prototype is. And again, if you lose a prototype, all things that are going to drag out your timeline. So what are things that we can do to kind of address and mitigate those challenges? Well, first off, like I was saying before, be sure that you're planning additional time for shipping and prototype delivery. Knowing ahead of time and setting expectations for your team or your client for how long a remote study is really going to take is really important. And it may be that deciding factor of, well, should we do this remotely? Or by the time we've carried all of this out and done all these logistics, could we have just waited 3 weeks and done this in person and really got it done faster in the long run? Secondly, something that we've done a lot of recently is what we call tech checks with our participants. So what that is A day or two ahead of time, we're connecting with that participant and we're testing the tech that they have. So we're making sure that they can use their laptop to get on the web conference, and they have a webcam that allows us to see them, and they have a good quality mic so we can hear them. And that way, we do that tech check a day or two ahead of time. That way, when the usability study comes, that whole session is spent actually evaluating the device and not battling with these tech issues of the participant doesn't know how to get on the video conference, or they don't know how to connect to Wi-Fi, so on and so forth. Additionally, with those tech checks, one of the things we've started to do is we see a lot of participants that have varying quality levels of their own devices. So laptops that are anywhere from brand new to 10 years old and they barely run, webcams that don't really work, cameras that are cracked, or microphones that are really poor quality. So what we've started to do is say, you know what, let's just get away from all of those challenges and let's actually ship the materials to the participant that we want them to use. Let's ship them a laptop, let's ship them a webcam, and then let's use this tech check call to kind of bring them up to speed on this new computer and this new webcam that we at PD know works, but may not be familiar to our user. And let's teach them how to use it. Let's teach them how to get it all set up. That way, when we come to the usability study, everything runs nice and clean. We have a really good quality picture and we have really good quality audio, assuming that the Wi-Fi doesn't fail. Next, something else that we've considered is actually using those laptops and webcams that we're sending participants as the incentive. That way, we don't have to worry about the participants sending them back to us, them getting damaged in shipping, or them needing to be cleaned, which all of those things can really, again, expand your project timeline. So instead, when we recruit participants, we tell them that we'll incentivize them with a laptop and a webcam as opposed to paying them with cash. And if they want to participate in that study, that's an informed decision that they can make ahead of time, but it's something that's really useful for us from a logistics standpoint. Fourth, develop extra prototypes in case of damage. Depending on the fidelity and the level of your prototype, that can be really, really expensive. But it can also really, really draw out your project timeline if you only develop one prototype and you start putting it in the mail and are shipping it around and you're just crossing your fingers that it's not going to get broke or it's not going to get lost. So it can really be more beneficial to develop extra prototypes, even if there's a slight cost increase up front, because the other expenses is that you can't carry out your study at all, and then you have to wait for a new prototype to be developed in the event that one is damaged. And then the other thing to do is optimize your prototype designs for easier disinfection. Make sure that you have your protocols for cleaning kind of dialed in ahead of time. Know how you're going to disinfect things, what the protocol is, what that timeline is, as well as considering that if your prototypes are really expensive and costly to produce, maybe consider what elements of that prototype are most likely to fail or to break. And instead of developing a whole bunch of full-scale prototypes, develop prototype accessories or pieces that can just be plug and play. If one breaks, you can plug the next one in to kind of mitigate the cost of full-scale prototypes. Finally, we'll go into the confidentiality hurdle. When we talk about confidentiality in this sense, we're really talking about intellectual property and confidentiality of our clients and the products that they're developing. In these instances, if we are really mailing product to participants, unlike in a usability lab scenario where we can make sure that participants are not taking pictures of the device and posting those to social media during their session, we don't have that same control in remote studies. And we can't really guarantee in any way that IP will be protected. Now, there are some mitigations for that, but the main thing is just making sure that your client or your team is aware of that ahead of time. That way you don't find yourself in some hot water down the road. So the main mitigation for confidentiality, your standard NDAs, again, send those to participants ahead of time, set their expectations, just like a consent form. Hey, please don't take pictures of this. Don't post it on social media. Don't talk about it. But at the end of the day, you're really just asking them that, and that you can't be there physically to prevent them from doing it. So there's always a risk there. If you're evaluating digital prototypes, maybe it's a digital GUI, maybe it's a digital IFU, as opposed to sending or emailing those as files to your participant, share them instead in a URL or some other password protected platform that prevents the participant from actually owning a copy of that, or not owning, but maintaining a copy of it after the study is finished. Again, kind of under that same password protected idea, if you are using URLs to host a clickable prototype, make sure that they're password protected and make sure that you're modifying that URL after the study's ended so that participants don't have access. So then that kind of brings us on to some of our conclusions based off of those hurdles. So really, when's the best time to wait? When should we do remote research and when should we wait for in-person research? So these are some questions to consider and some questions that you may ask yourself ahead of time. So the first question being, is the environment in which this product will be used critical in understanding the user experience? So for example, do we need to be in a hospital room? Do we need to be in a surgical suite? Do we need to be standing in the participant's house to really understand all of this? And if so, it's probably better to wait. With imperfect data, we make imperfect decisions. So we don't want to produce a study that has a lot of issues and then take the data from that study and consider it as good as it can be. If we really think that the environment is important, let's be sure that we test in that environment, in which case, let's not do remote research quite yet. Let's push it off until in-person can happen. Secondly, are there others who might be simultaneously using the product that can't be present or simulated for testing? Kind of what Katie's talked about earlier, if you're talking about the interaction of a nurse and a surgeon, maybe there are specific tasks with a device that the surgeon and the nurse really need to interact with a lot to make sure they're using that product efficiently. But if you look a little deeper, maybe there's some tasks that are specific to the nurse, there's some tasks that are specific to the surgeon that we can test independently and remotely and kind of get some data and make some informed decisions. And then when we can test them in person, kind of test that remaining workflow of when the communication between those two is really important. So it may not always be an all or none situation. You may be able to get some answers with remote research, and you may have to save some of it for in person. And then third, does my research require a distraction-free controlled environment in order to yield confidence in the results? What that means is, for example, time on task. If you have a time-critical task that you want to evaluate and you need to get a distraction-free baseline time of how long it takes a user to perform a critical task, like a defibrillation or something like that, then it's probably best to wait. Because again, as we've talked about, we can't guarantee distraction-free solid data with the remote research always. And then secondly, thinking of that from a summative human factors validation study perspective. In our summative study, we really want to have the utmost experimental control, and we want to have accounted for all extraneous and confounding variables, because this is our summative study and we need to validate this device in a very specific use case. And to all the things that we've said before, in this instance, we would not recommend conducting any summative testing at all remotely, instead saving that for in-person research. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back to Katie for our final conclusions and takeaways.
Okay, so moving ahead, there are definitely hurdles, as we talked about, and maybe some decisions that need to be made regarding, holding off on doing your research. But I hope that you're also taking away some opportunities for how you can move forward with remote research, because there are definitely contexts when it can be very valuable. So there are several candidate research topics that can really be successful with remote testing. First being, if you're evaluating any sort of 2D concept sketches using storyboards or the sketches themselves, those are easily shareable. And you can use a web context just as much as a piece of paper to evaluate those types of designs and prototypes. In addition, in these cases, you can get a sample from across the globe, essentially, of participants to give feedback on your concepts without having to travel to 20 different cities to get that feedback. You can do all that remotely, much more efficiently, much more cost effective if you're evaluating these in a 2D form. This applies to GUI formative testing as well, or graphical user interface. If the user can interact, you can share the software with the user either by passing control to them on the web conference or by sharing a URL and allowing them to sort of perform that usability test right there in front of you. You can record it. You can watch as they go through and get their feedback and probe on their experience just as you would in person. Finally, another 2D format that you can evaluate obviously is an IFU or QRG. As Colton talked about, as physical product as well, as long as you're in that formative state where you're still iterating your design, you're still trying to probe in and understand root cause, understand the experience the participant is having and how you can improve your designs. These are all great candidates for remote research that can keep you moving forward. But when should you stop? So thinking about, if you need a controlled setting, Colton alluded to this earlier. He didn't allude to it. He explicitly said, summative usability testing, we would recommend waiting for that controlled setting. Again, it can be very costly if you run a summative test and you find out that there's a study artifact that impacted your data and you have to run the whole thing again. That artifact could be, again, noise in the kitchen when they're trying to evaluate the study or the product, distractions and changes in lighting and so forth that you can't control in someone's home. So these are things that you want to make sure that you're testing under consistent, reliable, repeatable circumstances. So doing that testing in person, either in a lab or in context where you can be consistent is best. And finally, if you're testing to that end, performance of the product or of the user, just to understand task success, time on task, number of errors specifically, it's better if you can watch those types of things in person and again, control your environment. So not all research is created equal. We highly recommend and hope that you learn sort of some do's and don'ts. And we would really love if you were able to sort of take away some of the ideas about how to consider each research protocol specifically, how to sort of consider each and decide whether to move forward or whether to stop. And with that, we thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you very much, Katie and Colton. That was very helpful for me. I wish I would have known some of those things back when I was designing instruments for orthopedics, but I know that a very relevant topic today, so I appreciate your time. Thank you also to the audience. I know the next session starts in 10 minutes or so, and we hope to see you at some of the next sessions throughout the day as we wrap up this summit. So thank you all and have a great day.